watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
I'm Mark Golub, and on September 9th, an Egyptian mob assaulted the Israeli embassy in Cairo, to the extent to which the Israeli ambassador to Cairo and much of the diplomatic staff in Cairo had to be airlifted out of Egypt. The assault took place while members of the Egyptian army, the Guard, stood by and watched. This was not the first assault on the Israeli embassy. There had also been one 2 weeks earlier when someone had scaled the embassy wall, taken an Israeli flag, thrown it down to protesters who burnt the flag while chanting, "Give us weapons and we'll kill all the Jews." When the Arab Spring first took place and the media in America tried to report on the possible wave of democracy throughout the Arab world, there were many who pointed out that there did not seem to be any anti-American or anti-Israel slogans among the protesters. And there were many in the Jewish community, many analysts, who tried to assure the Jewish world that it was not likely that anything would happen to injure the Arab-Israeli peace that's existed for the last 30 years, however cold that peace might be, and that the Muslim Brotherhood would not likely take power in Egypt after the ouster of Hosni Mubarak. What does this most recent series of events mean for the future of the Israeli-Egyptian peace and for the safety and security of the Israeli people and the State of Israel itself? For some analysis, we are pleased to be joined once again by one of the brightest and most articulate analysts on the American Jewish scene today, and one who writes often and speaks often about the State of Israel in a most compelling way. And I'm speaking of the Executive Director of the American Jewish Committee, David Harris. David, thank you again for giving us some time.
My pleasure, Mark.
David, I remember distinctly discussing the Arab Spring with you. I remember seeing what you've written. And one of the things you tried to tell the Jewish world when it happened was, we don't know yet where this is going to go. And you were a voice of caution among some voices which were purely optimistic. And you said in a piece you wrote, I believe it was called Navigating Democracy in the Arab World, you expressed your hope that in fact what was happening in the Arab world and in Egypt in particular would bring a wave of democracy. But you warned the American Jewish community that we didn't know enough yet. When you see what happened at the Israeli embassy, what's it say to you, and how significant an event is it in your mind?
Well, first of all, Mark, it's great to be back on Shalom TV, and thank you for having me. Yeah, I was one of those analysts who was a little less optimistic. Look, we all want to be hopeful, Mark, let's be clear. It's not a question about not wanting democracy, freedom, human rights. Of course, we all do. But, you know, hoping and wanting are not are not the stuff of policy. They're the stuff of emotion. And my analysis really began with the fact that Hosni Mubarak stood on several pillars during his 30 years. And among those pillars was a commitment to maintain the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Cold peace, as you said, to be sure, but nonetheless to maintain the peace treaty as one of the pillars of his regime. A second pillar, by the way, was the U.S.-Egyptian relationship. And a third pillar was that at the end of the day, he did not particularly like the Muslim Brotherhood. He did not like their kissing cousins, Hamas, across the border in Gaza. He did not like the Iranians, who were also fueling radicalism. So it seemed to me that the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak might also challenge the three pillars. After all, the successors did not want to be associated with some of the foundations of the earlier regime. Number one. Number two, we tend to project. It's a very natural human tendency. Americans, others, we project. You know, we think instinctively people want what we want. So when they see what happens on the streets in Cairo, you know, what they see is Joan Baez singing, Bob Dylan singing, our own days in the 60s or 70s on American campuses. They project what they think we want onto the Egyptians. They saw what happened in Eastern Europe 20 years ago, and they assume again it's the same thing. And it wasn't necessarily the same thing. It doesn't mean there weren't Bob Dylan's and Joan Baez's on Tahrir Square. I'm sure there were. But it also didn't mean that they were necessarily on the trajectory to leadership, which brings us to recent events. We see the results of this turmoil, of this unfinished business of the Egyptian revolution. But the abhorrence of Israel is widespread. And you know, in a way, why shouldn't it be if one understands Egypt? Even with the Mubarak policy, even with the Sadat policy before, it was always top down. It was never bottom up. It was never about teaching in the schools about Israel, Zionism, or Jews. It was never about preaching in the mosques. It was never about telling the story in the media. So why should we be surprised that you have this outburst of thousands and thousands of people who are looking for the enemy that they've been told over the years and decades are the Jews, the Israeli flag, the state of Israel. At the same time, I don't think that the military regime now in power wants this or needs this. And that's why at the end of the day, I want to be slightly hopeful, Mark, that the Israeli diplomatic team will go back to Cairo, not because there's any new love, but because the military regime in Egypt is not ready to dismantle the treaty, is also not ready to tell other embassies in Cairo, you too may be at risk, because our police may choose to be asleep when your embassy is attacked. It caused embarrassment, and of course it prompted the United States to mobilize very quickly to use whatever leverage it still had in Egypt to tell the Egyptian government this is unacceptable. So in the calculus of the military regime, I don't think this was what they wanted. At the same time, it happened, and it tells a story.
And the army stood by and
That's
let it
the point.
happen.
Right.
That, by the way, shocked me, because everybody has said that Egypt needs American military aid, and that the military that is still in power, and that some have even suggested that the coup of Mubarak, getting him out, was really done by the military itself, that they want to retain a relationship to the United States, and the United States obviously wants Egypt to maintain a peaceful relationship to Israel. And yet the army permitted this to happen, David.
Right, and it did. And you know, we'll perhaps one day we'll know, Mark, where along the chain of command, you know, that message started. At the very top, near the top, somewhere closer to the middle. I don't have the answers as we speak today. The answers may yet emerge. But yes, it does. It tells a dual narrative. It tells a narrative of a population that, by and large, has been steadily fed an anti-Israel diet, and the peace process of the last 30 years has not filtered through to the average person on the street. That's a sad reality. On the other hand, the narrative is that the current government, and it's only presumably a temporary government, we don't know what comes next,
Correct.
is not ready to throw it all to the wind and say, to hell with the 30-year treaty. They're not ready to do that. And they're still mindful of the U.S. role, yes.
Okay. When you talk to your wife, are you worried about the future of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty?
When I talk to my wife, I'm worried about lots of things in the Middle East, including the current state of Israel, of Egypt, its direction, and of course, with its direction, what happens to the peace treaty. Sure, sure. Look, the very fact that as we speak, Israel is now accelerating its plans to complete the fence, a couple hundred kilometers, a fence, suggests that something
Along?
along the border between Israel and Egypt.
Correct, because Egypt has now permitted more terrorist incursions along its border.
Well, so the point is something has changed. I mean,
Yes.
even as we try and retain the peace treaty, which, by the way, is not just in the interests of Israel, we need to emphasize, it's every bit as much in the interests of Egypt. This is not a favor that one country did to another. But look what's changed. Israel is scampering as best it can now to complete a fence. It's going to take some time. Profound concerns in Israel about the Sinai. The appearance that Egypt has largely lost control of the Sinai, which has become a haven for smugglers, including armed smugglers, potentially terrorists moving back and forth. If you look at the map, you see the Red Sea, you see Gaza, you see lots of things in the area. So this can't be good over the long haul for Egypt either. It's certainly not good for Israel, and it's certainly not good for American interests.
By the way, David, we contacted the Israeli consulate in New York and asked them for comment. And they asked us sort of to leave it alone in terms of discussing with them, that they said this was a very sensitive issue for them. So obviously there's something about this that troubles Israel in a way that normally we don't experience. And I'm thinking to myself, sometimes there's we romanticize the position someone like you is in, and the American Jewish Committee, and it's as if somehow you have secret communiques that come to you, and you have information that many of us might not have. It might, I'm sure in some instances it's true, and in some it's a wishful thinking on our part. But do you know anything about how the Israeli government has in some way experienced and is going to be reacting to the fact that their Israeli ambassador had to leave Cairo? That's question one. And question two, has the American Jewish Committee learned anything about the extent to which the Muslim Brotherhood is in fact gaining more power within the Egyptian power structure than was once thought would happen? So let's take them one at a time.
Sure. Okay.
First, what do you know about how Israel is reacting, and then we'll ask about the Muslim Brotherhood.
As you'll understand, Mark, I can't speak for Israel. I shouldn't speak for Israel.
Of course.
But it's my understanding, and I think it's probably pretty obvious to your viewers as well, that the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty is a cornerstone of Israeli foreign and strategic policy. So from the Israeli perspective, I would assume they're going to do everything possible to salvage it, everything possible. And they're not going to do anything publicly that could in any way contradict that goal. And on the assumption that there are those in Egypt that also share the desire to sustain the treaty, they're going to work as quietly and as effectively as they can, number one, to recommit to the treaty, and number two, to get the Israeli diplomatic team back in place in Cairo with appropriate protection as quickly as they can.
Again, to me, and if it means more to me than it should, you tell me. I just can't imagine a country permitting a mob, rioters, to force ambassadors to their country out of the country. It's inconceivable here in America that some group would force diplomats to get on a plane and leave the country. So it seems to me this is very dramatic in terms of the history of the Israeli-Egyptian relationship. Am I making too much of it?
No, the stakes when we talk about Egypt couldn't be higher. I mean, no matter how you circle this issue, Mark, look, Egypt is by far the most populous and therefore most influential Arab country. It's always been a leader in the Arab world, and often beyond, in the non-aligned movement, for example. Israel and Egypt share a border. The peace treaty presumably serves as a model of what can be between an Arab country and Israel. I mean, keep going down the list. The stakes couldn't be higher here. So yes, there's every reason for concern, concerns that we expressed already months ago amidst the euphoria, this kind of uncritical, unfiltered euphoria. But at the same time, we can't just walk away and say, you know what, The country is now in the grips of the Muslim Brotherhood or other radicals who are anti-American, anti-Israel, perhaps anti-Semitic. Well, what's the next country? Can't afford to do it. Egypt's too important. So from the perspective of Israel and from the perspective of the United States, they have to re-engage Egypt. Look, there's no monolithic power in Egypt today. There may one day be. But right now there's a competition of forces. It's all in play. And the Muslim Brotherhood, may have an upper hand because they're better organized. Yes, it's true. They've had more time to organize. But not every Egyptian identifies with the Muslim Brotherhood. Not every Egyptian wants Sharia law to be imposed on Egypt. Not every Egyptian wants Egypt to go backwards while the rest of the world's going forwards. So it's a question of trying to find out who those people are and engage with them. And appropriately, from the outside, it's always difficult, Mark, but appropriately try to sort of strengthen their resolve. But we can't just walk away from Egypt as if we're just another country.
Yes, and by the way, obviously, I'm not suggesting we walk away.
Nor am I suggesting that you were suggesting.
My concern is, does this signal something much more dangerous than at the moment it seems to be being reported in the Jewish press and in the secular media? To me, this is a huge story, but it seemed to only have one day staying power, and then it disappeared. And I said, I want to talk to David Harris to see whether am I making more of this than I should, or in fact, does David feel that the fact that in Egypt, not only has the border become porous, not only are arms going through, not only are terrorists going through, but that in essence the establishment permitted, even if it was only for one day, a mob to throw the Israeli diplomatic corps out of Cairo. And my own reaction is, that's huge. And I said to myself, I wanted to hear whether you agree with me, or whether, even though it's important, you say to yourself, it doesn't signal something as perhaps catastrophic as Mark Golub is making it out to be.
I would not say today, Mark, that it is not catastrophic. It is very consequential and very telling. The fact that it's a one-day media story, as you say, may also be the fact that when you open the papers every day, when you turn on cable news every day, there are so many breaking stories from this part of the world. They're all competing with each other. They're all displacing each other. So I'll step back for a moment and look at it not just as David Harris, AJC, but as concerned American in a region where the United States has profound interests. I have to worry, Mark. In the short term, at least, I have lots of reason for concern. From that euphoria of a few months ago that spoke of this Arab Spring, and the new dawn, I'm looking at a very different configuration right now, not just as David Harris, AJC, but as David Harris, concerned American citizen who cares about the position of the United States in the region, who cares about the strength of the forces of moderation in the region. I have worries in Egypt. I don't yet know what Libya is going to look like. Syria is still very much in play, but I don't know that I should have any satisfaction from any of the projected outcomes right now. Quietly, the West has lost Lebanon again. The majority of the cabinet in Lebanon today is under the sway of Hezbollah, which has become the power broker in the country. Gaza remains in the hands of Hamas, which in turn has signed a reconciliation agreement with the Palestinian Authority and Fatah in the West Bank. The Palestinians are throwing caution to the wind and going to the United Nations in an end run around the peace process. Can we count on Jordan's stability forever and ever? I pray for it. But can I bet on it? And above all, there's the looming shadow of Iran, which over the last 6 months during the so-called Arab Spring has gone a get-out-of-jail card, because the attention has been focused everywhere else. And the stakes in Iran, perhaps, are even higher. And Iran's hand is being seen throughout the region, by the way, including in Iraq. As the United States begins to pull its forces out of Iraq, are we entirely certain that what we leave behind in Iraq will be a pro-Western, pro-American country, or how much sway will Iran hold there? So when I look at the region today, I have lots of reason for concern, but I'm not only in it for today, nor are you. There's a tomorrow and there's a day after. The stakes are high, and we simply can't walk away from the region.
As an American, I want to point out you also wrote a fabulous piece, which you entitled Christians at Risk, a Jewish Concern. And you spoke about how in Egypt, you mentioned the Copts and you mentioned others as well, that in essence there has been a certain kind of repression in Egypt that was bothering you. This was even before it was directed specifically at Jews or Israel. Speak about that for one moment.
I've understood as a member of a minority, as a Jew, and we are a minority everywhere in the world outside the state of Israel, that the litmus test for how a country respects human rights and civil rights more generally can be narrowed to how it treats its most vulnerable minorities. If Jews feel secure, then the country is saying something about its respect for human rights more generally. So what I said in this article that you referred to was, first, if the world had paid more attention to the treatment of Jews in the Arab countries some years ago, rather than avert their eyes, ignore what happened, and watch the Jews being hounded out and persecuted, as my wife and her family were in Libya, then maybe we would not have arrived at this point. But the world didn't give a darn. There was almost no coverage in the media. There were no UN resolutions. There was no outcry from the human rights community to the treatment of Jews, so they're gone. So now the majority populations have to look for other scapegoats. There are no Jews. And in Egypt, who is it? It's the Copts. They represent approximately 10% of the population. And my point in writing this piece was, if I want to have faith in the new Egypt that emerges, I'm going to look at how they treat their minorities. If the Copts feel secure, if the Copts have an equal place at the table, not privileged, just an equal place, the same way I would want Jews to have an equal place in the United States or France or Australia, then I know Egypt's pointed in the right direction. But no one can tell me Egypt's pointed in the right direction, David. You should be encouraged even as they continue to persecute 10% of their population. I can't buy it. So for me, they become a test. And for those Egyptians that care about trying to create a true democracy that respects pluralism, I know that they too understand the Copts become more than just their neighbors. They become the test.
One more question on this whole area. In a way you've touched on it, but I want to ask it directly. What do you think is behind the move among whatever groups are now anti-Israel? What motivates them now to go after the Israeli embassy and to want to eliminate the Israeli presence in Egypt? Why?
Mark, I think that sometimes we Jews want to live in a self-constructed bubble. And once again, we want to believe that everyone thinks like we do, acts like we do, wants what we want. Most of us don't speak Arabic. You know, even those that go to the Arab world, and I've met some, and they stay at the Mamounia in Marrakesh, or they stay at the Hilton in Cairo, and they meet their guide and one or two other people, and they leave and they say, wow, I really understand these countries today. What in the world do they truly understand? Unless you really speak Arabic, unless you're able to get beneath that surface of the Hilton hotels and the Mamounia hotels and really understand what makes these societies tick, you're clueless. And the best thing you can do is have the humility to understand it. Look, I'm clueless about many parts of the world. I accept it. I accept it. These are societies that sadly have been fed a steady diet of anti-Semitism. Not just anti-Zionism, but very often anti-Semitism. They've been fed conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory. Books like Mein Kampf are in Arabic. They're readily available. They've been widely distributed. We have any number of examples, Mark, that you could show on Shalom TV of Egyptian TV series, of Syrian TV series that are classically anti-Semitic, that take the tropes of European anti-Semitism, things like the blood libel, and they superimpose them in the Arabic language on Arabic societies. And you know, when a country like Libya, for example, which I happen to know a little better, has no Jews left since '67, those people absorb all of these images from the media, from the mosque, from the schools, from wherever, without any counter images. After all, if you never meet a Jew, why shouldn't a Jew have horns? If you never meet a Jew, why shouldn't a Jew want to be the kidnapper and killer of your child for Passover purposes or whatever? You've never met a Jew. So you depend on the authority figures in your society, who are the media personalities, the preacher in the mosque, the teacher in the school, whoever it may be. So it's so deeply, deeply rooted, I'm sorry to say, whereas I must tell you, among the older generation, who remember Jews as their neighbors in Tripoli and in Cairo and in Aleppo and in Damascus, very often there's a nostalgia for the Jews, but most don't. And the second thing, I think we don't fully appreciate, Mark, how Israel is still not accepted as a reality, and how the Jewish people's claim to self-determination and its claim to being an indigenous people connected to the ancestral land of the Jewish people is rejected in the Arab world. It goes that deep. In other words, Israel is seen as a modern-day crusader state. It's not seen as a legitimate, authentic state populated by Jews who have reconnected to their ancestral homeland, to the story of Abraham, to the story of Moses, to the exodus from Egypt, to the centrality of Jerusalem. They don't buy it. They don't accept it. Look, I accept the Muslim story about Mecca and Medina. I have no problem accepting it. I accept the Christian story and its narrative. It's not my faith, but I don't question it. But they still question, in so many cases, whether these Jews are there by right or by sufferance in the state of Israel. And finally, I think we also underestimate something else, and that is that these Jews, who in the mosques, parishioners have been told, were the sons of what? Of monkeys and apes. That's how they were taught. These Jews, who were seen as the sheep who were led to slaughter in Auschwitz, how could it possibly be that those Jews, 3 years after the Second World War, defeated the mighty Arab nation? How was it possible? And how was it possible that they defeated them a second and a third time and a fourth time? How was it possible that these Jews, whom the anti-Semitic teachers had explained were demonic and weak and all the rest, how could they become so strong? Well, only through these bizarre conspiracy theories. But the point I'm making, Mark, is that many in the Arab world, not all of course, but many in the Arab world still can't come to grips either with Jews as Jews, or with the Jewish connection to the state of Israel, or with the very fact that this tiny little nation somehow has stood up to the mighty Arab nation again and again, and stood its ground. So my point is, too many American Jews, I think, don't dig deep enough. Because at the end of the day, we want to believe it's much simpler. You know, we were all raised on Hollywood. We want to believe that there are happy endings to all of these things. Look, I want a happy ending, no less than anyone else. Believe me, I've devoted my life not just to defending the state of Israel and the Jewish people, but even more to the search for peace. I want a good night's sleep for myself and for every Jew on the face of the planet, including the people of Israel. And that means a time when there's peace, and there's coexistence, and there's mutual respect. But we can't live in these kind of elaborate la-la lands that we create, where we live in this kind of self-delusional bubble.
And Jews do that?
And some Jews do, not all by any stretch, but there were those. And by the way, not just Jews. I mean, look at how many Americans viewed the Arab Spring. You know, Jeffersonian democracy is right around the corner. I mean, it wasn't long ago, Mark, that Assad, the leader of Syria, the thug in chief, was called by American leaders a potential reformer. I mean, let's remember, our own government continued to believe for quite a while that Assad was a potential reformer. Assad, a potential reformer? As my kids would say, give me a break.
You gave us a wonderful overview of what the Egyptian and Arab mentality is and how it's been influenced in anti-Semitic ways. I'm wondering as you speak how Mubarak's ouster in some way permitted this to bubble up, because most of the things you described were true a year ago. And a year ago, they weren't storming the Israeli embassy.
Because Mubarak kept a lid on it. Look, go back to Sadat, the real hero. I mean, the real hero who gave his life in the end, who was assassinated 2 years after the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty in 1981. He was assassinated. Sadat had been an anti-Semite. Sadat had had pro-Nazi sympathies. Sadat had no love of Israel. The genius of Sadat, and bless his memory at the end of the day, notwithstanding what I just said, was that at the end of the day he cared more about the Egyptian future. He cared more about Egypt's construction than Israel's destruction. He didn't enter into the peace treaty because he suddenly loved Israel, but he came to understand that for him to build Egypt, he could not devote all the resources of the country and all those young lives of Egyptians to destroying Israel. At the point at which other Arab leaders understand that fundamental point, you don't have to love your neighbor. I hope one day they will. The Bible teaches us. But at the end of the day, look at Gaza. Given the first chance in its history ever, to rule itself, to create a new model, potentially to become a new Singapore, what did it choose to do? It chose to become Somalia. Because at the end of the day, the desire to destroy Israel was more powerful than the desire to construct Gaza. We need more people like King Hussein of Jordan, of blessed memory, Anwar Sadat, who understood the real goal is to give your own people a better future. Hosni Mubarak was not a Zionist, but at the end of the day, he understood that maintaining this cornerstone of Egyptian foreign policy served Egypt's interests. It kept the border quiet. It allowed him to focus on internal issues. It kept his relationship with the United States strong. He made other mistakes, that was clear. But at the same time, he understood this. I hope that future Arab leaders will also understood what King Hussein understood, what King Abdullah of Jordan today understands, what the Moroccan leadership understands, what Mubarak understood, and that is Israel is there to stay. You may love it, you may not, accept it, move on. The Arab world is falling farther and farther behind the Asian tigers, behind other parts of the world that are growing rapidly. Focus on internal political, economic, and social development. Move into the 21st century. Give your people what they need, democracy and development, dignity, and we'll build a better world.
And the dilemma, as you describe it, is that so many people felt that on the one hand, Mubarak was the stabilizing force, and on the other hand, he seems to have been now a dictator, whom the Obama administration and many who really care about freedom throughout the world believe had to go. And we have an instance in which something that might be better for the world in general doesn't seem to be in Israel's interest. And you who have championed liberal causes your entire life, you must struggle with that also. Where do you come out on this, on the issue of Mubarak was good for Israel, but in some way was anti-liberal, was anti-democratic, and was in some way a dictator, and yet his ouster has made it more difficult for the state of Israel to live in peace with with Egypt. Where do you come out on this?
It's an extraordinarily difficult dilemma, and it's also exemplified by the Shah versus Khomeini in Iran. Jimmy Carter turned against the Shah. The Shah was not a pure Democrat, and in the end we got Khomeini. Which would we prefer today, the Shah in power or Khomeini's successors in power? But having said that, it need not be, it should not be an either or, black or white, all or nothing situation, Mark. Because if it is, we get ourselves into this situation. Look, I respect very much people in power who have to make decisions in countries like the United States. It's very easy to second guess them when you're on the sidelines. You know, you don't have to deal with the repercussions of your decisions. So, you know, I can spout whatever I want, and I'm not responsible for. But I will say this: the Arab Human Development Report under UN auspices, which I have cited in my writing for years and years and years, told the story. And the story was and is that in the Arab world, there's a freedom deficit, there's a gender deficit, and there's a knowledge deficit. Those are the three core issues that are holding the Arab world back. And true friends of the Arab world, including the United States over the years, should not have neglected those issues. They should have taken leaders by the hand, sometimes gently, sometimes a little more forcefully, and said to them, look, if you want to stay in power and you want our continued support, you cannot continue to suppress the rights of 50% of your population who are female, or whatever the issue may be. But instead, we saw them as strategic partners, places for our military bases, or as economic partners for our markets or our energy sources, and we ignored the rest. And in doing so, we infantilized these countries. And now the chickens are coming home to roost. So, yeah, I mean, we occasionally paid lip service to democracy and development, but was it sustained? Was it smartly done? Well, we see the answer right now. The answer is it wasn't. And we've got to do a better job. So we avoid these all or nothing situations where we have to choose between a Shah who is less than perfect and a Khomeini who's even less than perfect.
And in the Egyptian model?
In the Egyptian model, the same thing. Look at how much aid we gave over the years to Egypt. Go back to '79. The U.S. took on the financial responsibility for helping to maintain the peace between Israel and Egypt. Mark, you go back a few years, it's really quite stunning. Egypt and South Korea in 1950, 60 years ago, had the exact same per capita GNP. Egypt and South Korea. Fast forward 60 years. South Korea is one of the leading nations in the world, and where's Egypt? The Arab argument is usually, well, we suffered from colonialism and occupation, and that held us back. South Korea? Ask them about the Japanese occupation over decades. Ask them about the devastation wrought by that occupation. So why could South Korea develop so magnificently, so impressively, to the point where we're buying their cars, we're buying their electronics, their per capita income is skyrocketing, and countries like Egypt were left behind? Are we, the United States, who is a friend of Egypt, doing the Egyptians a favor? Why can't we learn the lessons from South Korea and others and apply them to Egypt? Obviously, every country is different, Mark. No two countries are identical. But there are lessons that can be drawn and customized. So I think we've got to do a better job of saying that when we believe in democracy and we believe in development, we mean it. We're going to be there on the rainy days and not just the sunny days, and not just in this administration, but the next administration, and not just because we're do-gooders, although we are, but also because we have a profound national interest in trying to ensure that these countries go in the right direction, because if they don't, it's going to come back to haunt us in ways that will make 9/11 repeat itself, I'm afraid, Mark. So the stakes couldn't be higher, and we need leadership.
You are an extraordinary leader. It is always so wonderful to talk to you. Thank you for letting me meet with you. We are meeting now as the Jewish world celebrates a new year, Rosh Hashanah and then Yom Kippur. I want you to just speak right to our audience. What's your wish for the Jewish world and really for the world as a whole as we begin a new year now?
My wish is really quite simple, and that is that we never abandon hope. We're not just the people of the book, we're the people of hope. The whole history, the whole journey of the Jewish people has been the triumph of hope over despair. And let's remember that the name of the national anthem that Israel chose for itself, Hatikva, means the hope. So yes, we have profound challenges here at home. We didn't speak about them today because the subject was the Middle East, and in the Middle East and focused on our beloved Israel. But never, 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 never should we abandon hope, the belief in the correctness of our journey, or the knowledge that one day things will improve because of us and because of our efforts. So Shana Tova to all of the viewers, and thank you, Mark, for this opportunity.
It is wonderful. What a wonderful message. You always have something important to say to us.
Thanks,
I
Mark.
wish you kol tuv hatzlacha and a shana
Toda
tova
rabba.
mituka, a
Gam lecha.
sweet,
Thank
happy
you.
new year. And we'll talk next time about domestic issues as well. Thank you,
Okay.
David.
My pleasure.
And that was my conversation with David Harris and his thoughts. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any ideas or comments you have to the ideas that David expressed. Please be in touch with me, email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. And so until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.